Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices. Our hostess for today's program is Teresa Miller, Executive Director for the Oklahoma Center for Poets and Writers at OSU Tulsa.
Hello, everyone. I'm Teresa Miller, and welcome to Writing Out Loud. You're not going to believe this, but my very, very special guest today is Gail Collins, who's editor of the New York Times op-ed page. Thanks for being here, Gail.
It's a pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. You started out as a journalist, worked for UPI for a while. What were some of the important lessons you learned out in the field?
As a report, you know, everything I've done is about reporting when you get down to it. In fact, at the book fair, I met one of Doug Marlette's students who asked me about, what do he said, I'm not a journalist, but I want to be a columnist. How do I do that? And the interesting thing about columnists and the interesting thing about the editorial writers that I have at the Times is that they all have to be really good reporters. You just have to be able, whether you learn it officially or just figure it out, you've got to be able to go out and find out more than your readers who are reading the same stuff in the newspaper that you are know, and find new ways to report it and new ways to verify the information. So the reporting thing is a big deal, no matter what you're doing.
I bet it is. What was your first big story?
Let's see. Well, when I came to UPI, I was, which was my first sort of national media thing. One of the first big things I did was John Lennon's assassination. My husband was working with me then. We were both at UPI on the Metro desk, and it happened in the middle of the afternoon, early evening, I guess. And we worked all night, and you just work like a maniac on a wire service when stuff like that happens. And on the way home in the morning, we were driving back to our apartment in Brooklyn, and we turned on the radio, and they were playing his music. And Danny turned to me and said, "My God, this is so sad." And we really hadn't focused until that moment on the fact that it was a terrible, sad thing that happened because it was such a huge news story.
When you're writing a story that reporters all over the world are writing this story, how do you make it your own?
What we do, what the stuff I do now, a lot of it is about voice. It's about the way you approach it. It's a tricky thing to sort of look at a collection of facts and find some way basically to spin it, although spin is a word that we don't use not in an insincere way, but just find some way to put it all in context and turn it into a story that people can understand and look at in a different way. That's sort of the trick to it, I think.
Is that hard to do sometimes?
Oh, sometimes it's really hard to do, and I've noticed, and it worries me that it's very hard to find young people who are good opinion columnists, people, the next generation of Maureen Dowds and Tom Friedman's. It doesn't seem to be something that they do. It's really, really, really hard to go out twice a week and find something that you can put into 700 words.
Exactly.
That's really observed and that's going to give people a new insight into something and that they'll be talking about afterward. And if what you're doing falls through at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you can figure out some way to get something else together that's going to go out at 7 o'clock at night. It's a real art form and a craft, and I don't know if young people today do that stuff anymore.
I wonder about that, in all kinds of writing. When you were doing the straight reporting, was it hard sometimes to be objective?
Yeah, the objectivity thing is something that I think less and less people really believe in, which is worrisome to me. It's a very American theory that you can do objective reporting, that a newspaper can go out and report stuff without taking sides to what's going on, and it's always imperfect. Anybody who's ever been at an event and then sees the report of the event knows that they didn't see it the same way that the reporter did. But I think it's a very American kind of ideal, the idea that you can look at things without taking sides. It's something politically, particularly, Americans like to believe in, that you don't have to be a Democrat or a Republican, that you can just sort of, on each issue, try to look at it objectively. And it's a great effort. You have all these editors and all these people trying on every single issue to achieve this, and you never really do. But the fact that you're always trying every day to come close to it is what makes American journalism the way it is. And it's something that the new generation of sort of bloggers and internet people don't really believe in to a great extent. And maybe in another generation it'll be gone. Maybe we'll be doing things a different way. I'll be sad if that happens, but it's certainly possible.
As you made the transition from being a UPI reporter to being a columnist, what kinds of topics were the first that appealed to you?
I did, well, before I went to UPI, I'd been in Connecticut, and I started a news service there to cover the state legislature, because I think you know, here in Oklahoma, everywhere, state legislatures are sort of underreported on. You don't really often get people, it's hard to get people interested in state legislative stuff, and it is so important on so many issues. You know, the state legislature rules your life, and nobody knows who these guys are, and they just don't have the celebrity or the profile that members of Congress say do. So I was in Connecticut, and I started doing some reporting in Hartford, and then I created the news service, and finally I was doing every little town in Connecticut, you know, saying, this bill passed, and this is what it will mean for Derby, you know, and so on and so forth. But while I was doing that, I tried really hard to find ways to make these stories interesting for average readers, which is truly a lift and a half. So what I started doing was trying to write them in a funny way, you know, sort of amusing, or, you know, try to find some ways. Every day we would try to think of new ways. We'd turn them into songs, you know. It was sort of like trying to teach a recalcitrant third grade, except it was the readers of Connecticut. And, you know, that kind of was the way I learned to be a columnist, and to just sort of think over and over again about ways to make the stuff that I had seen interesting to somebody else.
Do you think that some reporters go overboard that way, some columnists, and do a dumbing down of material?
Sometimes there's especially, I keep saying especially with younger reporters, and this is not what I mean.
Well, yeah, sort of.
Sort of. But anyway, especially with people who are doing stuff on the web, when you read blogs and stuff, people mistake sort of a high level of cynicism and outrage with either honesty or with style, and it's not. It's just a high level of cynicism and outrage, and that kind of stuff I think really does lead to not only a dumbing down, but a sense of just alienation on the part of the people who are reading. It's all bad, they're all jerks, everything's terrible, and so therefore why should we pay any attention?
Well, while you were in Connecticut, you met a lot of interesting people, I'm sure. Tell us about Joe Lieberman, because he's had a very interesting political transition recently.
He sure has. You never think, you know, when you're in a state capital, that all these guys you see running around doing are going to be the next generation of, you know, senators and vice presidential candidates and so on. He was the Senate Majority Leader when I was there, and he was sort of the child star at that point in time. And I wrote one thing about him, that he was in his 30s, I guess, back then, and I said he's 30-something. He looks like he's about 49. But the good news is when he's 65, he'll still look like he's about 49. This looks like a face that's going to go on forever.
Right.
As he got older, he kept quoting that to me over and over again, you know. But he was always a very cautious politician, and he was always sort of somebody who, he had certain issues he was very committed to, kind of social welfare issues, so, you know, spending more money for social programs, labor, things like that. But he was always sort of very conservative on other things, and very much inclined to work with the Republicans. Back then in Connecticut, the two parties worked together much better than any place in the country right now, I think. So he came up in a different sort of way. Did
you see him as a potential presidential candidate back then? Did he have that kind of potential that you see?
I saw him as a person who saw himself as a potential presidential candidate.
That says it all.
And there's always some of those running around, and sometimes it makes sense, and sometimes you're just shocked. I mean, right now in New York, our governor, George Pataki, sees himself as a presidential candidate, and you just look at it and go, oh, my Lord, sir, you know, please. But that was never that way with Joe Lieberman. He was always sort of a quality kind of candidate.
When you look back over all of your columns, and when I look back at stuff I wrote maybe 10 years ago, I think, gosh, did I write that? Do you have that feeling with your columns? Do your opinions change?
Not so much. I think, you know, I sort of consistently had stuff I've been worried about, you know, kind of forever. And I came from Cincinnati and from the Midwest and sort of solid Republican people. So I've always sort of been more in favor of kind of tidy, efficient government than most people that I was growing up with were. You know? It was not a high priority when I was in college, say, but so no, I do. And sometimes you read things you write and you think, oh, good Lord in heaven, you know, that's awful. Good, what was I thinking? But not usually.
You're editor of the New York Times op-ed page. What's a typical day like for you, or do you have typical days?
I have sort of typical days. Usually, I've found that for me, having breakfast with people works really well. That you know that. I don't know how people do lunches because it takes a long time. You got to go around. So I often have breakfast at the office in the corporate dining room with people, and they, you know, you move in and out for half an hour. So I do that, and then we always have a board meeting. There's 18 people on the editorial board, and we meet. The main board meets 3 times a week at 10:30, and then we have a smaller regional board that writes editorials for. On local government, on the suburbs and on the city and on the state, and we meet on another day. So we go through the board, everybody's an expert in something, and we go around and everybody talks about what their things are that they're doing, and we just try to find bottom lines everybody agrees on. We sometimes fight, not too often. Our biggest fights, everybody always says, what is your biggest fight you've ever had on the board about? And to tell you the truth, it's about geese.
Geese, okay. We need an explanation of that.
I'm very big on, there are a lot of people on my board that have very tender feelings about wild animals, and I'm sort of very pragmatic about them. I probably have a closer to an Oklahoma attitude to animals. You know, I think that, you don't want them to become extinct and you don't want them to suffer, but beyond that, you know, whatever is necessary gets done. And so I've always been really in favor of killing geese in particular because they're a terrible problem in New York and Connecticut. They're just all over the place right now. And we've had very, very violent, even more violent, I think, than the entire series of war in Iraq fights were the geese fights that we've had. Yeah.
What are some of the hardest decisions you've had to make as editor?
As far as policy stuff goes, the war for sure. That happened right when I became editor. You know, we flew into all this stuff. I came on in the summer of 2001, and I'd been a columnist, so I really didn't have much experience in almost anything that I was doing at that point in time. It was a very boring period, if you remember back then, when George Bush first became president. You know, the economy was going sort of okay, and there wasn't any fights anywhere. It was just kind of blah-de-blah-de-blah. And I thought, well, we'll just figure out how to make boredom interesting, and that will be our job. Ha, ha, ha. So when all this stuff came down, it was really a challenge, and trying to figure out exactly what our position was on the invasion as it was coming up was just an enormous challenge. My board didn't agree about it. Nobody agreed about it, and that was the hardest thing I think I had to do. I remember calling the publisher from Switzerland when I was there, and I just have to talk to you about this stuff because I don't know what I'm going to do about this, which you don't normally do. But it all worked out in the end. But it was a hard time, and I've always been sorry that, on the one hand, we weren't more skeptical about the weapons of mass destruction argument. And we wrote about that afterwards and apologized for that. I believed all the politicians. There were people in my board who believed the weapons inspectors. And if we paid more attention to those arguments, I think we still would have thought there were weapons of mass destruction. We would have given our readers a better sense of what the arguments were on both sides. So that part of it, I think, is my biggest regret. On the other hand, when I look back on those editorials, we figured out that we warned our readers that if we went in without a lot of support internationally, that it was going to be very bad, that it was bad for our position in the world, and that the dangers, although it would be easy to go in, of staying in, the dangers of a civil war, the dangers of trying to build a government and build a nation were just enormous, and that we didn't think we could do this without international support on a broad level. And, you know, that was, if the person, me, who was dumb enough to think there were weapons of mass destruction could figure that out, I keep wondering now why nobody else did at the time.
What are some of the most common misconceptions about the New York Times?
It's the thing that's most important to me when I go around to talk to people about is the fact that the editorial pages don't have anything to do with the news pages. It's something that people in the business just take for granted, but readers don't make those subtle distinctions, you know, and everybody, often I get letters saying, I hate the New York Times, or I love the New York Times because you're the paper who's run by Maureen Dowd and Paul Krugman. It's the editorial department is totally separate from the news side of the paper. We're in a different part of the building. We do different stuff. I report directly to the publisher. I don't talk to the executive editor who runs the news side. My people don't talk to their people. In the morning, my people come in and say, I can't believe they reported and I know the news people come in and say, oh my God, I can't believe they said but we're not the same. We don't work together, and that's something that's it's really important, I think, for people to understand.
You've written a wonderful book, national bestseller, America's Women.
Thank you.
400 years of dolls, drudges, helpmates, and heroines. Why did you decide to write this book?
You know, it started during the millennium. The magazine, the Times Magazine, asked me if I would write the introduction to their special issue on women over the last 1,000 years. And it was a tiny little subject.
Tiny little subject, yes.
So we did, and the editor who gave me the job said, I don't want to like push you in one direction or the other, but this feels like a win to me, the story of women over the last 1,000 years. And when I started to write it, you look back on it and you realize that for 1,000 years or better, the Western world's vision of men and women were that women were the household, that women took care of the home, that men took care of the public world, that it was men's job to lead and it was women's job to defer and follow, and everything that followed from that. And although there were exceptions and so on, that was the vision for 1,000 years, and in my lifetime that changed. And that thought was just once the kind of, you know, resonated with me. I thought, good God in heaven, you know, you wake up every day happy when you think about it like that. And I really wanted to tell that story. And so this is sort of the first book. I'm working on a second one about 1960 to the present. But it was just a pleasure to write. I had the best time reading all the stories about what happened to American women.
Yeah, share some of these stories.
Oh, the first thing that everybody says to me when they read the book is, I couldn't believe how hard they worked back then. It was just the story of just what I tried to do is to write about it from the ground up and what life was like when you were a colonial woman and how you perceived the world and the stuff you thought about, and then sort of take it up through. And you just run into all these amazing women that I'd never heard of before. One of my favorites that I always love to talk about is Elizabeth Jennings, who nobody has ever heard about. Elizabeth Jennings is an African-American young teacher, and it's 1854, and she lives in New York, and she's running to catch the horse-drawn trolley because she's on her way to church on Sunday because she plays the organ. She's late. She's sort of anxious. She gets the trolley. She crawls up, and and the conductor says, "You'll have to wait. This one is for white people only." And Elizabeth Jennings, in 1854, we haven't had the Civil War yet, goes nuts, and she starts punching the conductor. She is pummeling him. She is grabbing onto the side. She is kicking and screaming. They drag her out. They finally throw her in jail for resisting arrest. She hires a lawyer who turns out to be Chester Alan Arthur, who is the future president. He represents her. She sues the trolley company, and she wins. And New York City's mass transit was integrated in 1854 because of Elizabeth Jennings. And this was going on at a time when this happened all around the North. You had women, regular women, black women, who went crazy because somebody said, get to the car for the African Americans someplace else. Sojourner Truth was arrested. Harriet Tubman was arrested. People you've never heard of were arrested all over the North. And I always thought it was because at that period, you know, for any woman who was respectable to go outside by herself was a very big deal. It was such a homebound era. And for a black woman to do it was even harder because you knew people looked at you and didn't accept the fact that you were a gentlewoman because you were black. And you get all dressed up and you go out for your thing, whatever it is. It's probably something really important. And you get into the trolley or you get into the train, and they say, no, you know, go back into that dirty old car in the back. And it drove women crazy. And then it's so amazing to me that 100 years later, when you start integrating mass transit throughout the South, that it's always the women. It's Rosa Parks. It's women who make those first initial forays and those first fights. It's just something intrinsic to women, this mass transit thing. It just fascinated me the whole time that I was looking at it.
Why are we not more familiar with these names?
I don't know. You know, I wrote a thing once saying, I've noticed in Topeka you seem remarkably statue-free, which I think is a wonderful thing, actually. In New York we have tons of statues.
Right.
They're all of guys, except for the great New York City heroines, Joan of Arc and Alice in Wonderland. They have their own statues. And I wrote a thing once saying we need more women. It took like 20 years to get a statue of Eleanor Roosevelt, and she lived in Manhattan all her life, and it just took forever. So I said we need more of these things, and the first one we should do is Elizabeth Jennings, and we should put her in Grand Central Station, which, you know, and every time I talk about that, at the end women get up and say, well, let's do that right now. We haven't done it yet, but it's a project that I hope devoutly will someday come to pass.
As you're moving through the years with this book and doing all of this incredible research, what encouraging trends do you see starting to emerge, and maybe some not so encouraging trends?
Well, you know, one thing you realize when you read the book, if it was just the leadership and determination of women that made changes happen, changes would have happened a long time. You look at the amazing, amazing women in the 19th century that you had, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and all the rest, incredible women, and they really lost. I mean, we finally got the right to vote in 1920, for God's sake, but it was so hard to do these things because it was possible not to do them, because the economic structure of the country was such that it worked better for the economy if women were kept in their place. I mean, you needed women to work in factories, to work as domestics, and to work mainly as farm wives, helping their husbands, a job that was so amazingly hard that they didn't have time to think about anything else except what they were doing. But as the economy changed, as things became, as you moved into the post-industrial age, the information age, where a woman could do almost any job just as well as the man, the economy couldn't afford to lose that labor anymore. And you look at how fast things changed when they changed, and you realize that there was something in operation there that was far more powerful than just our desire to see change happen. And I think that was sort of the great moment. And then you see what happened. You realize how many people's shoulders, you know, the women were standing on when this all fell into place. It was just incredible.
What about women journalists during these various eras?
Women had been doing journalism a little bit off and on from almost the beginning. There were a lot of women who owned newspapers very early, but they weren't actually, there really weren't any journalists back then. There were politicians who had newspapers. You know, it wasn't a journalistic thing. When women really got into it, it was really around the turn of the century. And you had Nellie Bly and people like that who were sort of the first heroine journalists. And they often did what they called back then stunt journalism. They would had themselves committed to a madhouse so that they could write about the madhouse. Or Nellie Bly went around the world in 80 days. Still can't imagine how she did that. She just had like this little tiny basket of stuff she carried with her. And they wore so much stuff back then. You know, you were just amazed when you look back at women in the 19th century who did these amazing things, how much clothes they had on their bodies while they were doing them, you know. Dorothy Dix, who is one of my particular favorites, who spent a lot of time in the middle of the 19th century going around looking to see where mentally ill people were kept in various towns, asking about it, and they were all in jails or in barns or they were locked up someplace. Nobody dealt with mentally ill people seriously, and she used that information to lobby. But the thing about her that I love to tell people is to do that, to go to all these towns, she traveled at a time when women almost never traveled. And you read her letters, and you're on these trains, and the trains are always late. They often fall off the tracks. This is not a good time for not crashing. And they're dirty, and they're hot, and they're stuffy, and there's, of course, no bathrooms, no place to wash up, nothing like that. They don't make their schedules. You're often abandoned someplace forever. And then you read these things about, well, I got to the train was late, I finally got where I was going, then I got off, I got a horse and carriage, the carriage broke down because there was too much mud, I rode the horse died, I walked for 10 miles, and then at one point she says, and then I got to the river and they put me on a log and floated me down the river. And to read these things is amazing, but to read them and to realize she's doing all this stuff with a corset from her hips to her shoulders and clothes that go down to her ankles, you think, oh my God, woman, this is incredible.
Do you see in your position that you have the power to influence positions for women in the future? Is that a big responsibility for you, do you think?
Well, I think there's an encouragement thing that you really want to do. You know, whenever sort of young women come by or write to me and say they want to know about how to do something, I always try to help them. But there's just so many amazing women coming along. You just feel very confident about it. You know, people often ask me if the Times has ever changed their editorial position on some big issue. Mm-hmm. And I always say, well, yeah, we changed our position on suffrage, because until 1920, the New York Times was against giving women the right to vote.
Isn't that amazing?
And I read some of these editorials. They're just wonderful. There are things like, well, it's said by some that all human beings have the right to vote. This is clearly not true. Small children do not have the right to vote. Therefore, why should women have the right to vote? And in our boardroom, when I run the board meetings, I look up, and on the other side there are two portraits of Henry Raymond and Charles Miller, who were the two editors who wrote all those editorials. You know, so once in a while I like to go in early, kind of say, "Hi guys, I got your job."
Gail, it's been so wonderful having you here today. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.